Before the Cherokee were forced to walk the infamous Trail of Tears, their lives were rich with tradition, culture, and a deep connection to their ancestral lands. The Indian Removal Act of 1830, however, set in motion a series of brutal and heart-wrenching events that would forever scar their people. Families were torn from their homes, marched through unbearable conditions, and suffered immeasurable losses. The stories of those who endured this nightmare have been passed down through generations, tales of courage, heartbreak, and the haunting memories of a journey that claimed thousands of lives. The following accounts delve into the darkest moments of the Trail of Tears, where survival was uncertain and the spirits of those lost along the way still echo through the land. These are the horrors told by the Cherokee, stories of unimaginable suffering and resilience where every step taken was a step deeper into despair. This is where their journey begins. Story 1. The Midnight Raids. The night was silent, save for the occasional rustle of wind through the trees and the distant sounds of nocturnal creatures stirring in the dense forests surrounding the Cherokee village. It was late spring, and the people of the village had just planted their crops. For generations, this land had been their home. They had grown up learning the ways of the earth, respecting its rhythms, and living in harmony with nature. But on this night, something far more sinister than any predator lurked just beyond the tree line. Inside a modest cabin, a family of 5 lay asleep. The father, Tsali, a respected elder of the community, had spent the day working the fields with his 2 sons, while his wife, Elise, had tended to their youngest daughter, Noya, a bright-eyed child of only 6 summers. Tsali's eyes were heavy with the weight of another long day, but his mind, as always, was troubled. Rumors of the soldiers' approach had reached him weeks ago. Still, like many, he had hoped that they were exaggerated. Perhaps he had thought the soldiers would never come, and they could continue their peaceful existence. But that night, as the family slept soundly, the faint sound of horses' hooves and the clanking of metal armor echoed from the distance. At first, the sound was faint, almost drowned out by the usual noises of the night. But soon the ground began to tremble as more horses and soldiers approached, the sound of marching boots growing louder. Then came the shouts, harsh and guttural, cutting through the night air like a blade. Tsali awoke with a start, his heart racing. He rushed to the door, his bare feet hitting the cold dirt floor, and threw it open. What he saw was the stuff of nightmares. His eyes widened as he witnessed the nightmare unfolding, soldiers in dark uniforms storming through the village, their torches casting long shadows on the walls of the homes they had come to destroy. The smell of smoke quickly filled the air as the soldiers set fire to the homes one by one. The crackling of the flames, mixed with the screams of men, women, and children, created an overwhelming cacophony of terror. "Get up, quickly!" Tsali shouted to his family, his voice cracking with urgency. His wife Elise jumped out of bed, frantically grabbing their children and wrapping them in blankets, her hands trembling as she heard the screams of their neighbors growing closer. The boys, confused and terrified, clung to their mother as Tsali grabbed a small hunting knife, his only weapon, and looked around desperately for a way to escape. Outside, the soldiers moved swiftly, kicking down doors and dragging people from their homes. Families were torn apart, with children screaming for their parents as they were ripped from their arms. The soldiers showed no mercy. Some elders, too weak to move quickly, were shot on the spot, their bodies left to burn in the homes they had lived in for decades. "Run, we have to go," Tsali urged, pulling his wife and children toward the back door of their home. They stumbled into the night, their feet bare and stumbling over the rough ground, as they made their way toward the forest that bordered the village. Behind them, they could see the glow of the flames growing larger, the entire village engulfed in an inferno. Noya, the youngest, whimpered as she was carried in her mother's arms, her small face buried in Elise's neck, trying to block out the horror around her. Tsali's eldest son, Waya, no more than 12, looked back at the only home he had ever known, his eyes wide with disbelief. He had heard the elders talk of this moment, but nothing could have prepared him for the terror that gripped his heart. Just as they reached the edge of the woods, the pounding of hooves grew louder behind them. Tsali turned to see a group of soldiers approaching fast. "Go! Don't stop!" he yelled at Elise, pushing her forward as he turned to face the soldiers. His knife was small, but it was all he had. He stood tall, his chest heaving with both fear and defiance, knowing that this was the moment he had dreaded but would not flee from. "Get out of the way, old man," one of the soldiers barked, his voice dripping with contempt as he raised his rifle. Tzali's grip tightened around his knife, his hand shaking, but his resolve never wavered. He took a deep breath, preparing to defend his family at any cost. But before he could act, the soldier fired. The shot echoed through the trees and Tzali fell to the ground, his body crumpling in the dirt. Elise, hearing the gunshot, turned just in time to see her husband fall. She let out a scream that tore through the night, but there was no time to mourn. She had to keep running, keep her children safe. With tears streaming down her face, she forced herself to run deeper into the woods, her children stumbling after her. Behind them, the soldiers set fire to their home, and the flames swallowed the village whole. That night, Tzali's family disappeared into the wilderness. They were not the only ones. Many Cherokee families scattered into the forests, their lives shattered by the soldiers' relentless brutality. But for Elise and her children, the journey was only beginning. As they ran, their hearts filled with both sorrow and anger, they knew that the land they had once called home was lost to them forever. Story 2. Death March of Winter. The biting cold pierced through the ragged clothing of the Cherokee marchers as they trudged through the snow, their steps heavy and slow. The sun, though high in the sky, offered no warmth. The vast frozen landscape stretched out endlessly before them, and the wind howled like a wild beast, carrying with it the voices of the dead. This was not a journey of hope. It was a death march, and the Cherokee knew it. Among the thousands forced to walk this unforgiving path was a young mother named Ahyoka. She was in her early 20s, her face already lined with the grief of the past months. In her arms she carried her infant daughter, Ayita, bundled in a thin blanket that offered little protection from the cold. Ayita had been born just weeks before the soldiers arrived, a symbol of life and hope in a world rapidly falling apart. But now, as Ahyoka marched with the others, she feared that her daughter might not survive the journey. Ahyoka's husband had been one of the first to fall, succumbing to fever in one of the overcrowded holding forts they had been imprisoned in before the march began. She had watched helplessly as his body was tossed into a mass grave, his face pale and sunken, unrecognizable in death. There had been no time for mourning. She had been forced to continue moving, carrying her newborn and the heavy weight of her sorrow with her. As the march continued, the Cherokee were given meager rations, just enough to keep them alive, but never enough to satisfy their hunger. Starvation gnawed at their bellies, and the cold seemed to seep into their very bones. Many had no shoes, their feet bleeding and frostbitten from walking over the frozen ground. The elderly and the sick were the first to fall, collapsing into the snow, their bodies quickly stiffening as death claimed them. Ahyoka's heart broke a little more with each passing day. She had seen too much death, too much suffering. The once proud Cherokee people, who had lived in harmony with the land for centuries, were now reduced to this, a line of broken souls slowly marching toward their doom. Ayita, too young to understand the horrors around her, slept most of the time, her tiny body pressed close to her mother's chest for warmth. Ahyoka whispered prayers to the Great Spirit, begging for mercy, begging for her daughter's survival. But as the days dragged on and the temperatures dropped further, her hope began to wither. One morning, after a particularly brutal night of snowstorms, Ahyoka awoke to find her daughter unusually still. She held her breath as she gently shook the baby, her fingers trembling as she peeled back the blanket to look at Ayita's face. Her heart stopped. Ayita's small lips were blue, her face pale as the snow around them. The baby was cold, her tiny body still and lifeless in her mother's arms. Ahyoka let out a wail that seemed to come from the depths of her soul, a cry so raw and full of pain that it echoed through the camp. Those around her turned their heads in silence, their own hearts heavy with grief. They too had lost children, parents, friends. They too knew the weight of death. But Ahyoka could not let go. She clutched Ayita's body to her chest, rocking back and forth, whispering to her as if the child were only sleeping. "Wake up, my little one, wake up, we have to keep going," she murmured, her voice broken. For hours she sat in the snow holding her baby, unwilling to let the soldiers take her away. The Cherokee around her continued to march, their heads down, their eyes hollow. Some whispered prayers for the mother and her lost child, while others silently wept for their own losses. Finally, as the sun began to set, a soldier approached her. His face was stern, his voice gruff. "You need to get up. Leave the child," he ordered. Ahyoka did not move. She could not leave her daughter behind, but the soldier grabbed her by the arm, yanking her to her feet. "Move!" he barked, pulling the baby from her arms and tossing the lifeless body into the snow. Ahyoka's scream filled the air once again, but the soldier was unmoved. He pushed her forward, forcing her to continue walking, even as her legs threatened to give out beneath her. With every step, she looked back at the small mound of snow where her daughter's body lay, disappearing from sight as the line of marchers moved on. That night, Ahyoka did not sleep. She sat with her knees drawn to her chest, rocking herself, her empty arms feeling heavier than they ever had. In the distance, she thought she heard a baby crying, but she knew it was only in her mind. The sound of that lost cry would haunt her for the rest of her days. The death march continued. Every day, more Cherokee fell, their bodies left behind, frozen in the snow, their souls forever tied to the land they were forced to leave. Ahyoka, though her heart was broken, kept walking. She had no choice. The trail stretched out before her, endless and cold, a path paved with the bones of her people. Story 3. The Spirit of Starvation. The Cherokee had walked for weeks, and the land had grown crueler with every passing day. The once lush forests and fertile lands they had known were now behind them, and ahead lay an expanse of barren, inhospitable ground. The trees became sparse, the rivers slow and brown, and the earth was cracked and dry. Food had always been scarce, but now it seemed like it had vanished entirely. The people were starving, their bodies withering away as they struggled to survive on meager rations that barely kept them alive. Among those suffering was an elder named Yonah, a man who had once been strong and proud, a leader in his village. His face, now gaunt and hollow, bore the weight of the hardship they all endured. His eyes, once bright with the knowledge of his people, had dimmed, clouded with exhaustion and hunger. Beside him walked his granddaughter, Gola, a young girl of barely 13, her small body reduced to skin and bones, her once lively spirit dulled by the relentless march. Yonah had raised Gola after her parents had died of fever years earlier. She was his only remaining family, and he had sworn to protect her. But as the days wore on, he could see the life slowly draining from her. Her steps were becoming weaker, her face paler, and her eyes had taken on a vacant stare. She no longer complained of hunger. There was no point. The hunger was constant, gnawing at their insides, a dull, ever-present pain that never went away. Each day, the soldiers who guarded them would toss out small portions of moldy cornmeal or dried meat, just enough to keep the Cherokee from collapsing en masse. Yonah would always give the largest portion of his share to Gola, but even that was not enough. The food was foul, often causing sickness more than it provided nourishment, and many of the Cherokee could no longer eat it without becoming ill. The strongest among them scavenged for anything they could find: wild roots, leaves, sometimes even insects. But there was little to be found in this desolate land. One afternoon, as the sun beat down relentlessly on the marchers, Yonah noticed a group of men ahead of them breaking off from the main line, their heads low, whispering among themselves. They were young, strong, at least as strong as any man could be in this condition, and their eyes were filled with a mixture of desperation and determination. Yonah watched as they disappeared into the nearby woods, their movements swift and secretive. Later that evening, as the camp settled down for the night, the men returned, carrying sacks over their shoulders. Yonah's heart quickened as he saw the bulging shapes inside the sacks. Food. They had found food. The men distributed small portions among those closest to them, and Yonah's mouth watered at the thought of a real meal. But there was something off about the men's behavior. They were quiet, too quiet, avoiding the eyes of the others as they handed out the pieces of meat and bread. Gola, noticing the food, tugged at Yonah's sleeve, her voice barely a whisper. "Grandfather, please. I'm so hungry." Her eyes were wide, filled with a desperate pleading that Yona could not bear to see. Yona hesitated, his instincts warning him that something was wrong. But his granddaughter's hunger, her frail body trembling with weakness, overpowered his caution. He approached one of the men, a tall figure with hollow cheeks and wild eyes, and asked for a small portion. The man handed him a piece of meat, greasy and dark, without a word. Yona brought it back to Gola, who tore into it eagerly, her small hands shaking as she devoured the food. Yona watched her, relief mingled with unease as he chewed his own portion slowly, the flavor strange and unfamiliar. That night, as the camp grew quiet and the Cherokee lay down to rest, Yona felt a creeping sickness in his stomach. He had eaten too quickly, too much after so many days of hunger, and his body was rebelling against the sudden intake of food. But it wasn't just the quantity, something else was wrong. The meat had tasted strange, almost metallic, and the aftertaste lingered unpleasantly on his tongue. Gola, too, had grown quiet. She lay beside him, curled up, her face pale and clammy. "Grandfather," she whispered, her voice weak. "My stomach hurts." Yona placed a hand on her forehead, his heart pounding with fear. She was burning with fever. He pulled her closer, murmuring soft words of comfort, though his own body was racked with pain. He could feel the sickness spreading through him, a cold, nauseating wave that gripped his insides and twisted them. As the night wore on, Yona's mind wandered back to the men in the woods, to the strange behavior and the dark, greasy meat. He had seen death many times before, knew its smell, its feel. A sickening realization began to take root in his mind, though he tried to push it away. It couldn't be. It couldn't be. But the signs were all there. The secretive whispers, the avoidance of eye contact, the too eager acceptance of food that had no obvious source. In this land, there were no deer, no game, nothing that could provide the kind of meat they had eaten. He looked around the camp at the faces of the men who had gone into the woods. One of them, a young warrior named Atohi, met his gaze. There was something dark in his eyes, something haunted. Yona's breath caught in his throat. He had heard the stories, whispered among the elders, of what desperate men would do in times of starvation. He had never believed them, had never thought his people would fall so low. But now, as he lay in the darkness, the truth clawed at his mind, refusing to be denied. The men had not found food in the woods, they had taken it from the dead. Yona's stomach churned with horror as he realized what he had eaten, what he had given to Gola. The bodies of the Cherokee who had fallen along the trail, their friends and family, had been scavenged for sustenance. In their desperation, the men had turned to the unthinkable. As the sickness in his stomach grew worse, Yona wept silently, his tears mixing with the dirt on his face. He had failed his granddaughter. In his attempt to protect her, to feed her, he had given her something poisoned not just by disease, but by the very souls of their people. By morning, Gola's fever had worsened. She lay motionless, her breathing shallow, her face ghostly pale. Yona held her hand, his own body trembling with weakness, his vision blurring from dehydration and exhaustion. Around them, the camp stirred to life, though many of the Cherokee could barely stand. They had no choice but to continue walking, even as more of them fell with each passing day. As they began to move, Gola did not. Yona knelt beside her, shaking her gently, his voice barely a whisper. "Gola, wake up. We have to keep going." But she did not stir. Her hand, still in his, had grown cold. Yona's heart shattered. He held her lifeless body close to him, rocking her back and forth as the others began to move around him. The soldiers shouted for him to keep up, but Yona no longer heard them. His world had narrowed to the small, fragile body in his arms, the child he had sworn to protect and had failed. When the soldiers finally came to take Gola's body away, Yona did not resist. He watched, numb, as they laid her among the other dead, their faces covered in blankets, their bodies left behind on the trail. There would be no burial, no ceremony, just the endless march forward, away from the land of their ancestors and into a future that felt as cold and barren as the land they walked through. Yona's legs moved automatically, his mind distant and empty. He no longer felt the hunger, the pain. All that remained was the hollow ache of loss, the knowledge that his granddaughter's soul would wander forever, lost to the land they had been forced to leave. And as the Cherokee continued their march, the spirits of the dead followed them, unseen but ever present, whispering through the trees, their voices carried by the wind. Story 4. The River of Lost Souls. The Mississippi River lay before the Cherokee like a wide, ominous expanse, its cold, dark waters churning with a slow but relentless current. The river was wide, much wider than any they had crossed before, and its banks were slick with mud, making each step treacherous. The Cherokee had already endured weeks of walking, their bodies weak from hunger, their spirits shattered from the relentless cruelty of their captors. Now, they stood on the edge of this final challenge, their faces hollow with fear and exhaustion. The soldiers overseeing the forced removal had provided boats, small, rickety vessels that barely looked seaworthy. There were too few boats for the number of people who needed to cross, and the ones available were overburdened, old and cracked. The sight of the makeshift rafts and leaky boats filled the Cherokee with dread. But they had no choice. The river was the only path forward, and they could not stay on the banks where the cold and starvation would claim them. Among those waiting to cross was a family of 3, a father named Atsadi, his wife Selu, and their young daughter Adisai, who was no more than 8 years old. The journey had already taken a toll on them. Selu had grown thin, her once strong frame weakened by weeks of marching through snow and mud. Atsadi, too, was gaunt and hollow-eyed, but he kept going for the sake of his family. Their daughter, Adisai, clung to her mother's side, her small hands wrapped tightly around the folds of Selu's tattered dress. The little girl's eyes, once bright with the curiosity of youth, now stared out at the world with a quiet, somber fear. She hadn't spoken much since the march began. Atsadi looked out over the river, the gray water reflecting the stormy sky above, and felt a deep unease settle in his chest. The river seemed angry, as if it knew the sorrow and suffering of those who were about to cross it. The sound of the water rushing past was loud, almost like the growl of some giant unseen creature, and Atsadi's heart raced as he thought about stepping into one of the frail boats. A group of soldiers barked orders at the Cherokee, forcing them to load into the vessels with no care for their safety. People were packed into the small boats like cattle, their bodies pressed close together as they balanced precariously on the wooden planks. Atsadi took his wife's hand and helped her step into one of the boats, his eyes never leaving the river. The boat rocked and swayed as more people climbed in, the water lapping at the sides, threatening to spill over. "Hold on tight," he whispered to Selu, his voice low but urgent. He lifted Adisai into the boat, settling her between him and her mother, his arms wrapped protectively around her small frame. The boat creaked under the weight of its passengers, and Atsadi could feel the wood straining beneath his feet. His breath came in short, anxious bursts as he watched the soldiers push them away from the shore. The boat wobbled as it moved into the current, the river immediately pulling them downstream. Atsadi gripped the sides of the boat, his knuckles white, as he watched the water rise higher and higher against the wooden sides. Around them, other boats were struggling too, some already taking on water, others spinning uncontrollably as they were caught in the river's powerful flow. For a brief moment, the boat seemed to stabilize, and Atsadi allowed himself a shallow breath of relief. But then, just as quickly, the boat hit something submerged beneath the surface, a tree branch or a rock, and lurched violently to one side. Water rushed in over the edge, cold and fast, soaking everyone's feet. Selu gasped, clutching Adisai tightly as the little girl whimpered, her small body trembling with fear. "Stay calm," Atsadi said, though his own heart was pounding so loudly he could barely hear himself. He tried to shift his weight, to balance the boat again, but it was no use. More water poured in, and suddenly the boat was sinking, the cold river swallowing it whole. It happened in an instant. One moment they were struggling to stay upright, and the next they were plunged into the freezing water. Atsadi's head went under, the shock of the cold knocking the breath from his lungs. He kicked frantically, his arms flailing as he struggled to find the surface. The river was strong, pulling him down, its icy hands wrapping around him, threatening to drag him into its depths forever. When he finally broke the surface, gasping for air, his first thought was of Selu and Adisai. His eyes darted frantically over the churning water, his heart racing with panic. "Selu!" he shouted, his voice hoarse and desperate. "Adisai!" For a terrifying moment he saw nothing but the gray, swirling water. Then, a few feet away, he saw Selu's head bobbing up and down, her arms thrashing as she tried to keep Adisai above the surface. The little girl was screaming, her voice high and shrill, filled with pure terror. Atsadi swam toward them, his muscles burning with the effort, his lungs aching from the cold. He grabbed hold of Selu's arm, pulling her close as he tried to keep them all afloat. But the river was merciless. The current was too strong, and even as Atsadi fought with everything he had, he could feel them being pulled farther and farther downstream. Around them, other boats were capsizing, other families crying out for help as they too were swallowed by the river. The soldiers on the shore did nothing. They stood and watched, their faces expressionless as the Cherokee were swept away, their cries for help lost in the roar of the river. Atsadi held on to Selu and Adisai with all the strength he had left, but he could feel his grip weakening. His arms ached, his body numb from the cold, and the river was pulling them apart. He could hear Selu sobbing, her voice choked with fear and exhaustion as she struggled to keep their daughter's head above water. I can't hold on," Selu gasped, her voice barely audible over the sound of the rushing water. Atsadi's heart clenched with panic. He couldn't lose them. He couldn't. "Hold on to me!" he shouted, his voice raw with desperation. But even as he said the words, he could feel Selu's grip slipping, her strength giving out. And then, with a final cry, they were torn apart. Atsadi's hands grasped at empty water as Selu and Adisai were pulled away from him, their bodies disappearing beneath the surface. He screamed their names, his voice hoarse and broken, but the river gave no answer. The cold water rushed into his mouth, choking him, filling his lungs as he fought to stay afloat. He didn't know how long he was in the water, how long he fought against the current. Time lost all meaning as he was tossed and turned by the river, his body growing weaker with every passing moment. Finally, mercifully, he felt something solid beneath his hands, a rock or a branch, and he clung to it with the last of his strength, pulling himself out of the water and onto the muddy shore. He lay there, gasping for breath, his body shaking uncontrollably from the cold. His vision blurred, and for a long time he couldn't move. All he could hear was the roar of the river behind him, the endless, relentless sound of the water that had taken everything from him. When he finally opened his eyes, the sun had begun to set, casting a dull gray light over the landscape. Atsadi's body ached, every muscle sore and stiff from the cold, but the pain in his heart was far worse. He sat up slowly, his eyes scanning the shore for any sign of his wife and daughter. But there was nothing. No bodies, no voices, just the silent, empty river stretching out before him. The Cherokee who had survived the crossing were gathering on the far shore, huddled together in small groups, their faces drawn with shock and grief. Many had lost loved ones to the river that day, and their cries of mourning filled the air, a haunting chorus of sorrow. Atsadi stood shakily, his legs weak beneath him, and began to walk along the shore, his eyes searching desperately for any sign of Selu and Adisai. His heart screamed for them, but the river remained silent. As darkness fell, Atsadi finally collapsed onto the ground, his body too weak to continue. He stared out at the river, its waters still and calm now, as if it had never claimed the lives of so many. The river, it seemed, was a graveyard, a place where the souls of the dead were forever lost. And as Atsadi sat there, broken and alone, he swore he could hear the voices of the lost, whispers carried on the wind, calling out to him from beneath the water. The river had taken his family, and now it called to him too, beckoning him to join them in its cold, dark depths. But Atsadi did not answer. He remained there, on the banks of the river, the voices of the lost forever haunting him, as he waited for a reunion that would never come. Story 5. The Haunting of Stockades. Before the forced march had even begun, the Cherokee were herded into holding forts, stockades that were more akin to prisons than temporary shelters. These stockades were scattered across the southeastern United States, crude and hastily built enclosures designed to house the Cherokee people before their inevitable removal westward. The stockades were overcrowded, dirty, and filled with the stench of sickness and death. Entire families were forced into cramped spaces where disease spread rapidly, and food and clean water were in short supply. One such stockade, Fort Cass, stood on the edge of a clearing, surrounded by dense forests. The tall wooden walls of the stockade loomed over the Cherokee prisoners, casting long shadows over the ground as the sun began to set. Inside, the atmosphere was thick with despair. Families huddled together for warmth, sharing what little food they had. The cries of infants too weak from hunger to wail properly filled the air alongside the occasional groan of the sick. There was no reprieve from the suffering. Among those imprisoned at Fort Cass was a young woman named Awanassa. She had been there for weeks, trapped with hundreds of others, watching helplessly as her friends and neighbors succumbed to disease. Typhus, dysentery, and cholera ran rampant through the stockade, claiming the lives of the old and the young alike. Every day, more bodies were dragged out of the wooden enclosures and dumped in shallow graves just outside the fort's gates, their names whispered by grieving families who would never see them again. Awanassa had been one of the few who still had hope when they first arrived. She had believed that if they could just survive long enough, perhaps the government would change its mind. Perhaps the soldiers would release them and allow them to return to their homes. But as the weeks passed, that hope had withered away. Her father had died within days of their arrival, his body ravaged by fever. Her younger brother, only 6 years old, had wasted away from starvation, his small frame too weak to fight off the sickness that eventually claimed him. Now Awanassa sat alone in the corner of the stockade, her knees drawn up to her chest, her once bright eyes dull with exhaustion. The bodies of the dead were removed from the stockade daily, but it was never quick enough. The smell of decay lingered in the air, and every breath she took was tainted with the stench of death. The soldiers who guarded them from the outside looked on with indifference, offering no help, no comfort. To them, the Cherokee were little more than animals, a problem to be managed. As the sun began to set that evening, the stockade grew quieter. The few who still had the strength to talk whispered in hushed tones, as if afraid of disturbing the silence. Awanassa looked around the enclosure, her gaze lingering on the faces of the others. Some were praying, their heads bowed, their lips moving in silent supplication. Others simply stared into the distance, their expressions blank, as if they had already accepted their fate. That night, as darkness descended fully over the stockade, something changed. A cold wind swept through the enclosure, more chilling than anything Awanassa had felt before. It cut through her thin clothing, sending a shiver down her spine. She pulled her blanket tighter around her shoulders, but it did little to ward off the sudden biting cold. The wind carried with it a sound, a soft, mournful whisper that seemed to echo through the walls of the stockade. Awanassa's heart began to race as she strained to hear the voices. At first, she thought it was just the wind, playing tricks on her mind, but the whispers grew louder, more distinct. They were voices, faint, distant, but unmistakable. Awanassa stood slowly, her legs unsteady beneath her, and looked around. The others in the stockade were stirring as well, their eyes wide with fear. They had heard the voices too. The air felt heavy, as if the weight of countless souls pressed down on them. The whispers seemed to come from every direction, rising and falling like the murmur of a crowd just out of sight. "What is that?" someone whispered, their voice trembling, but no one had an answer. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, filling the stockade with an eerie, otherworldly sound. Awanassa's skin prickled with fear. She turned toward the far corner of the stockade, where the bodies of those who had died earlier that day had been left, waiting to be taken out in the morning. The voices seemed to be coming from there. Slowly, cautiously, Awanassa moved closer, her feet dragging in the dirt as her body protested every step. The darkness was thick, making it hard to see, but she could just make out the shapes of the bodies covered with ragged blankets, their outlines barely visible in the dim light of the moon. The whispering was louder now, almost as if the dead themselves were speaking, calling out from beneath the blankets. She froze, her heart pounding in her chest. The air around her was cold, unnaturally cold. She could feel it settling into her bones, making it hard to breathe. And then, as she stood there staring at the still forms of the dead, one of the blankets shifted. Awanasa's breath caught in her throat. She blinked, telling herself it was a trick of the light, that the wind had moved the blanket. But then it happened again. The blanket twitched, as if something beneath it was stirring. The whispers grew louder, more urgent, filling her ears until it was all she could hear. With trembling hands, Awanasa reached for the edge of the blanket, her fingers cold and numb. She hesitated, her mind screaming at her to stop, to turn back. But something compelled her forward, some unseen force drawing her toward the bodies. Slowly, she pulled the blanket back, revealing the face of one of the dead. It was an elderly man, his skin pale and sunken, his eyes closed in death. But as Awanasa stared at him, his eyes suddenly snapped open. Awanasa screamed and stumbled backward, her hands flying to her mouth to stifle the sound. The man's eyes were wide, staring up at her with a blank, lifeless gaze. His mouth opened, but no sound came out, just a silent scream frozen in time. The whispers, louder now, seemed to come from his open mouth, filling the air with their haunting melody. She turned and ran, her heart racing, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Around her, others were waking, their eyes wide with fear as the whispers filled the stockade. Some clutched at their blankets, huddling together, while others stared at the walls, their faces pale and terrified. The voices did not stop. All through the night, they echoed through the stockade, whispering the names of the dead, calling out in sorrow and pain. The Cherokee whispered prayers, begging the spirits for mercy, but the voices did not answer. By morning, the voices had faded, leaving behind only a heavy silence. The soldiers came to collect the bodies, dragging them out of the stockade without a word. But the people inside were forever changed. The whispers of the dead had marked them, leaving behind an unshakable fear. The stockade was no longer just a prison. It was a place of haunting, a place where the dead lingered, unable to move on. Awanasa, her heart still pounding from the terror of the night before, sat in silence as the sun rose over the stockade. She could still hear the whispers, faint now, like a distant echo. The dead were still here, their spirits trapped within the wooden walls, their voices forever haunting those who remained. And as the days passed, the whispers did not leave. Every night, as darkness fell, the voices would return, calling out from the shadows, reminding the Cherokee that the spirits of the dead were never far away. The stockade became a place of dread, where the living were forced to walk alongside the souls of the lost, their cries mingling with the sorrow of the living.